evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right in to study some Jewish history together. So tonight, we turn our focus to the Russian Empire. Russia has... There's a lot we can say about Russia. Russia has always been a tremendous pill to swallow. It has always defeated all of its enemies, not through war or ingenuity or skill, only through its sheer vast size and the inability to actually swallow it. And we're going to discuss tonight really as the Russian Empire became the imperialistic Russian Empire and what that meant for the Jewish people and the really detrimental state that left the Jewish people in that came under the sphere of Russian influence. So, when we talk about today in 2022, we have once again Russia as a issue in the world with what's going on in the Ukraine, and we might look at this as strange if anyone, 20 years or younger, 30 years or younger might look at this as strange, but really we just had a short reprieve in the world from roughly the mid-90s until now, but really what we're seeing going on is much of what we have seen from Russia over the past, 200-300 years, maybe more, and therefore it's Putin's just bringing Russia back to where it's always been and back to its natural character is really what's going on. But what happened as we go into the 19th century, first of all, from a really a global perspective, from a macro perspective, there was a lot of tremendous changes in the Jewish world. We've been discussing many of them, but one that we have not addressed yet is the fact that there was a just explosion of world Jewish population at this point. If we look at the time of the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century, according to most accounts, there were maybe 1 to 2 million Jews in the world. Now, with a people that you only have 1 to 2 million of in the whole entire world, demographers would tell you that people is not going to last very long. That's not a number to be self-sustaining or to sustain. And but what's really remarkable is the fact that we had basically been 1 to 2 million people from really the second millennium. If you look at all the tragedy and the expulsions and attempted genocides and then once you factor in natural causes like the bubonic plague and low birth rate and infant mortality and low life expectancy and all these other things that went on from roughly the years 1000 until 1800, it's really a miracle that the Jewish people even survived that. And we always have to remind ourselves of the faithful words of Rav Yaakov Emden, how the biggest miracle on the map of world history is the fact that we're still here. And, if you've been following the Jewish Destiny series, what we've survived is truly miraculous. But you look at the numbers and see that at this point in the latter half of the second millennium, that there were according to some accounts, under 1 million Jews, but definitely not more than 2 million Jews. And the fact that we had really survived for a couple hundred years with those numbers is quite remarkable and quite miraculous. Now, what's just absolutely fascinating is during the course of the 19th century, the Jews go from those meager numbers of 1, maybe 2 million to, in the year 1900, there being almost 10 million Jews on the world map. And that's an amazing population growth. And, what's I guess slightly depressing about that is we basically hover there until modern times, until today, that we never go quite above 12, maybe 14 million Jews in the world. Obviously in the Holocaust, we're gonna hit a height before the Holocaust of over 12 million, maybe 13, maybe 14 million. It's gonna go down to almost half of that. And we're just going to get back to about where we were before the Holocaust, before the modern assimilation of Jews really starts cutting into our numbers, to the fact where today we're maybe 10 to 12 million Jews. So we're right back at the at the onset of the third millennium, at the the 21st century. We're essentially right where we were at the beginning of the 20th century in the year 1900. But that remarkable population growth happens during the 19th century, where we go from almost extinct to 10 times that, to almost 10 million. Now what causes that? What are the things we can look at for that? First of all, with the Industrial Revolution, modern medicine begins in the 19th century. I should say, really, medicine begins because we didn't have a lot before that. So things like infant mortality went down. We talk about childbirth today, and while it still happens, it is very rare, or it's very rare for a mother to die in pregnancy. But it used to be, I don't know if the number is 1 in 3, 1 in 4 women would die in pregnancy before this time period, and for a baby to survive, it was actually I don't know, maybe 1 in 2 actually survived at childbirth, and then even to make it out of the years of being an infant was very rare. But that changes in the 19th century, and we see that there's also a tremendous urbanization of the Jewish people. Before the 19th century is basically Anatevka, right, Fiddler on the Roof. Well, that's not such an accurate depiction of Jewish life in Europe. It's not that inaccurate either. And many Jews lived in these small shtetl, maybe 20, 30 families. And with the urbanization of the Jews coming to major urban centers, that led to better sanitation, better health in general, and it just made things better overall. The Jews once again are able to organize. In the organization, there's social Jewish groups that'll help out with the there's obviously tremendous poverty in Eastern Europe, but that'll be dealt with in many ways. So what's interesting is as we talk about Russia, and we're going to see that Russia had a goal of trying to eliminate their Jewish population, and one of the it is said that the policy of the Russian Tsar was 1/3 immigration, 1/3 1/3 immigration, 1/3 extermination, and 1/3 conversion. And we're going to see huge numbers of Jews immigrate to America, to the United Kingdom, to places like South Africa. And the numbers of millions, from the year 1880 until 2000 from the years 1880 until 1920, when immigration becomes illegal in America, essentially with the isolationism of America, we're going to see almost 2 million Jews come to America, but that's not going to make a dent in the Russian population because the population is going up so much as it is. So that's why, many millions will immigrate. It's not going to make a dent because of the population increase during this time. So that's an important backdrop as we understand the events that go on in Russia during this time period. Now, with the Industrial Revolution hitting all over the world again, they'll come to Russia much later than everywhere else. It's a question if it's even come to Russia yet. But the Jews were very involved from the beginning. The Jews they took the Industrial Revolution by storm, and it's going to be the beginning of the Jewish entrepreneur. We already mentioned before the Rothschilds, and we're going to talk about tonight Moses Montefiore. And you're going to we're going to meet for the first time Jewish entrepreneurs, Jewish businessmen. The beginning of Jews being really Jews having wealth, which they have not had in many centuries. And we're going to see the building of wealth within the Jewish community, and that'll mean tremendous things for the Jewish community as a whole. That's what we see as we come into the Russian Empire. Now, the ruling Tsarist Russia, the ruling class, the ruling family was the Romanovs. The first Tsar from the Romanov family is Mikhail Romanov, and the Romanovs will rule from the mid 18th century or the early 18th century until the Russian Revolution in 1917. And as we mentioned, they definitely had an anti-Jewish policy from the onset. There was never a philo-Semite amongst the Russian empires. There was we'll see some lightening of the anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic policies, but it never went away, and it exists until this day. It's fascinating that you have a revolution that will overthrow the Romanovs, but so much of the Russian, even though you have a revolution, you can't throw off your culture, and so much of the Russian culture that exists before the Russian Revolution exists after the Russian Revolution, and one thing that becomes firmly a part of communist Russia is anti-Semitism. Even though the Jews were very much a part of the communist revolution, once Stalin comes along, that's going to be the end of any Jews and the Russian government. We'll get to that when we get to that. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But the goal now was to really get rid of the Jews in Russia. Now, the Jewish problem, so to speak, in Russia comes along with imperialist Russia, because before Russia started conquering mass parts of Eastern Europe, there were not a tremendous amount of Jews in the Russian Empire. Again, Russian Empire is so vast, I'm sure there were sizable amounts, but compared to the greater population, they were not a noticeable minority in any way, shape, or form. But as the Russian Empire and the imperialism of Russia moves west, as we've addressed briefly in previous sessions, they conquered areas like the Ukraine, like Lithuania, like Poland, like White Russia, aka Belarus, and with those areas came tremendous swaths of Jewish population, so that the Romanovs found themselves all of a sudden in control of millions of Jews, of really the majority of the world Jewish population, and therefore their anti-Semitic policy comes into place. Now, one of the early policies of the Russian Empire was put into place by Catherine the Not-So-Great in 1791, and that's called the Pale of Settlement. By pale, we mean boundary, the boundary of settlement. That the Russians from that point, from 1791, and it'll exist until the fall of the Romanovs in 1917, they put basically the world's largest ghetto into place. That there were certain areas on essentially only within the western border, the western countries of the Russian Empire, where Jews were even allowed to live. That was referred to as the Pale of Settlement, and at its height, the Pale had about 5 million Jews, representing, about 40-50% of the world Jewish population right there in this area called the Pale of Settlement. Now, even within this area called the Pale, now the Pale were basically these countries that were conquered that had large Jewish populations, but even within the Pale, the Jews were often excluded from living in the population centers. Like, for example, Kiev, where all over the news today, Kiev was a place where Jews were not allowed to live within the Pale of Settlement. And while we'll see there were certain exceptions made for Jews who had, were university educated, were members of merchant guilds, etc., it was most Jews were restricted to live within very poor areas within this Pale of Settlement. Now, the area of the Pale of Settlement, if I can get my text right, we'll put a map up here on the screen. But the Pale of Settlement included modern-day Belarus, White Russia, Lithuania, Moldova, much of the Ukraine, East Central Poland, small parts of Latvia, which is now part of the Western Russian Federation, and that's really, those are, like I said, those are those countries that the Russian Empire conquers, and it extended east until east it went to the border of modern-day Russia. It went up to the Kingdom of Prussia, aka Germany, and Austria-Hungary. So basically, if you imagine the Russian Empire at its height, anything on the west side, and again, I guess I'll try and put a map up on the screen here in a moment. Anything on the west side was what we call the Pale of Settlement. So the Jews were forced to only live within this area. Now, by the way, this was about 20% of European Russia. And it's we talked before about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was that country. It was the Ukraine, or the Cossack country, because as we said, when the Cossacks conquered Ukraine, they basically switched from being Polish to being Russian. This is the area that was mainly part of the Pale of Settlement, and we're going to see that within the Pale that there's going to be a glimmer of hope for the Jews in the latter part of the 19th century, when Alexander II becomes the Tsar, the Emperor, and he's going to rule from 1855 to 1881, and he will actually expand the rights of the Jews if they are wealthy, if they are educated, they'll be allowed to live beyond the Pale and leave those areas, but that will and that'll actually give hope to the Jews during the rule of Alexander II that the Pale might be abolished. But those hopes will be dashed when he is assassinated in 1881, and the Jews are blamed for his assassination, and that sets off a number of pogroms and anti-Semitic attacks throughout Russia. So even when we see a little bit of a hope of reprieve, from the anti-Semitism of the Tsars, it's very short-lived, and that's what we see, and therefore this Pale is not exactly remembered as a very positive Jewish experience. Now, that being said, within the Pale and within ghettos as a whole, there's definitely the negative of the poverty and the terrible anti-Semitism and the situation that Jews live in. But at the flip side, Jews living in Jewish communities is a good thing, and I'm very pro-Jews living together in a community. And nowadays, we a lot of times jokingly call our neighborhoods ghettos. Like if you live in the ghetto of Brooklyn, of Flatbush or Borough Park, or here in Cleveland, in University Heights and Cleveland Heights and Beechwood, we see a lot of good by Jews living in a community and being close to each other, and some of that good comes out in the pale as well, as we're going to see with the development of the yeshivas, which we'll talk about next week, God willing. The yeshivas will develop within the Pale settlement. That's where they will be, and some of that success comes from the fact that Jews are living in one area together, and we're going to see other things will develop. The concept of the Yiddish theater comes up at this point. When we talk about the Haskalah next week, that will thrive, which is not a good thing, but that will thrive within the Pale settlement. So while there's a lot of negativity, and definitely the motives are negative, the Jews living in Jewish communities is a great thing, and therefore those positive aspects will come out of the Pale as well. Now, one of probably the most terrible of the Russian decrees is something referred to as the Cantonistim. Now, the Cantonist schools were schools that were established already in the 18th century. Actually, they were established in 1721 by a decree of Tsar Peter the Great, or the not so great. And basically, what these schools were is that in Russia there was the conscription to the Russian army was a life sentence almost. It was a 25-year conscription, and there was drafts and quotas, but the vast numbers of the Russian Empire were so great that the idea of being drafted into the Russian army did not affect the Jewish communities in the 1700s and the beginning of the imperialistic Russia, even into the early 1800s. And even this concept of the Cantonist schools didn't initially affect the Jews. But what the Cantonist schools were essentially is conscription to the army was at the age of 18, but they would take young boys at the age of 12 into these schools to basically prepare them to be drafted into the army. So they were basically military schools. It was the original concept of a military school. And the idea was to indoctrinate children who might otherwise not easily be indoctrinated at the age of 18, so they'd have the 5 years to prepare before they would go into the army. And that was the original concept of Peter the Great. Now, with Tsar Nikolai I, who is definitely one of our more anti-Semitic of the Romanovs, which, to be the most anti-Semitic of Romanov is quite an achievement, but he makes a decree on August 22nd, 1827, that made it that the Jews were liable for service. And what that meant is up until this point, even if a Jew was drafted, they could basically buy their way out of it. And there's, like I said, no shortage of people within the Russian Empire. So they would just find other people to take their place, or they would pay to go into the army in their place. And the Jews were basically until 1827 could avoid the army. But now with these large swaths of Jews in the Russian Empire, and through this decree, the Jews could not get out of the army, it led to a terrible situation for the Jewish community in Russia that in many ways we're still paying for today. Because while the conscription was 25 years, it was a spiritual death sentence for any Jew that went, and not only that, it was often a physical death sentence, as we'll see. The Russian army was never a fun place to be. I mean, let's face it, armies are not fun. Armies, being in an army, you watch, nowadays you go on YouTube and see any kind of video of the Israeli army, even the American army, and while the ROTC centers in America and recruitment centers try and make it like, oh, it's a great way to advance education and start your education. Will pay for your education, and they'll show you videos of soldiers working on technology. Let's face it, if you're deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, different places where American soldiers have been deployed, that's not going to be great living conditions. And in Israel, wherever you are during the conscription of Israeli soldiers, it's not a fun time. Let's face it, it's necessary, but it's not fun. And even the modern army is really a paradise compared to what the Russian army was like. So on a physical level, it's terrible, and on a spiritual level, it was more than terrible, because with Jews going to the army, they were it was a terrible situation from beginning to end, and many of the Jews that went either didn't come back or for sure didn't come back Jewish after 25 years in the Russian army. And it wasn't like you went and then you come home for R&R, you were gone for 25 years. That's what it was. So what happens with the forced conscription in 1827, there were quotas for the Jewish community, and the way that these quotas worked is the Jewish community had to provide 4 recruits for the army for every 1,000 Jews. So if you do your math for a minute, we mentioned there were upwards of 5 million Jews within the Pale of Settlement. And I'm just saying my calculator now because my brain's not working so well with numbers. So if you figure, that 4 for every 1,000 would have been, at any given point, about 20,000 Jewish recruits to the army. And but for Nikolai, he said that the Jews can't come to the army at the age of 18. They can't come out of their Jewish ghetto and go into our army. So therefore, we have to use the Cantonist schools for these Jews. So the forced conscription was not at the age of 18. It was at the age of, often 12 or sometimes even as young as 8, as records show, so that the children could be prepared to go to the army at the age of 18. And that was the decree. And what was terrible, or probably the most really just treacherous of this decree, is Nikolai did not put anything into place they didn't put recruiting offices in the Jewish community, and it definitely wasn't volunteer conscription. They turned to the Jewish community. They said, you have to provide us these 20,000 Jews per year to come into the Russian army. And they left it to the community to figure out, which you can imagine the strife and the fights and just the terrible situation that caused for the community. And every community dealt with this differently. There were some communities that would choose by lottery. There were some communities that would just send the sick, the infirm, the children of the poor, orphans, and again, you can imagine what that did for the Jewish community, and we talk about the class differences and religious animosity that will come to the forefront definitely within the Haskalah. You can guarantee it was never the children of the wealthy, it was never the children of the rabbi who went to the Cantonist schools. And therefore, it led to a terrible situation. Now, beyond this, we had the concept come up of something called the chappers. Chap in Yiddish means to grab. So there were people who would go and essentially kidnap children to fill the quota of the Russian army to the Cantonist schools. You can see what this caused for the Jewish community. First of all, for those poor children who went to the school, like we said, they did not come home or did not come home Jewish. But then you talk about the parents and the families of the children that were forced to go to these schools, and when it was done through quite often very unfair circumstances, a lot of when we get to the modern day state of Israel and the struggles between the religious and the non-religious, a lot of those sentiments really start at this point. They really do. And when we talk about the conditions of the Cantonist schools, they were absolutely terrible. First of all, there's about more than a 50% suicide rate of these children who went to the schools, and it was a forced conversion, indoctrination. That was the goal, and many of these kids would commit suicide as opposed to converting. And there were stories told of groups of these Cantonist children being taken to be baptized, and they would drown themselves. And they were forced to go to the Russian Orthodox services, and just a physically terrible situation, a emotionally terrible, a spiritually terrible situation. And when we look back at the time of the Cantonists, it's just a black mark on Jewish history, of which there are no winners, of which no one comes out on top. Of really, when we talk about the Russian goal of trying to break the Jewish community, it's almost a shock that this did not break the Jewish community, because it's just the shockwaves that it put throughout the Jewish community in so many ways, shapes, and forms. It was we can't say enough how terrible it was. Now, there were many rabbis who tried to do what they could to improve the situation. There were rabbis who were forced by the government to have to turn over the numbers, and they would just leave. They would resign. They would resign their position because they just couldn't bear to be involved in some of this. There were different rabbis, like, for example, the great Chavetz Chaim, who tried to do what they could to support the Cantonese children. In fact, the Chavetz Chaim wrote a whole book for Cantonese children on how they could somehow remain Jewish while in these Cantonese schools and then eventually in the Russian army. But like I said, there was just a time period of there being no winners. Now, this exists from, we said the decree was in 1827, and it exists until 1857, when after the Crimean War, which we'll talk about in a moment, the Russians were so embarrassed on the world stage, and so many of the really blemishes of the Russian Empire came to the forefront at this point, and so therefore, following the public and international criticism after the Crimean War, the Cantonese schools are closed. So they exist for 30 years, but in those 30 years, so much damage is done. And even after 1857, the war and the army and the lottery and all, and the numbers in the conscription was still in place. So even though they weren't taking children at the ages of 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, or whatever it was for the Cantonese schools, they were still going to be forced numbers of Jewish conscription at the age of 18. So even though the 30 years the Cantonese schools will wreak terrible havoc on the Jewish community, and then the continued forced conscription thereafter will also be part of the problem. So number one, we talk about the terrible situation of the Jews in Russia was the Pale Settlement. Number two is the Cantonistum and the Russian army in general. And then in general, just the goal of conversion. Many of these czars saw that their goal was, especially Tsar Alexander I in 1817, he was convinced that his ticket to the world to come was to forcibly convert the Jews, and he put many policies into place to try and forcibly convert the Jews, but none of them were successful, because there was no, at this point in Russia, there was no desire to be emancipated. There was no desire to assimilate into the Russian community, because the draw of the Western European Jew, where there was a more civilized, educated non-Jew to want to be like, that did not exist in Russia. So there's very little pressure within the Jewish community to assimilate into the Russian community. So as much as there were policies to try and get the Jews to convert, there were actually, during this time, more Russians who convert to Judaism than Jews who convert to Russian Orthodoxy at this point. So, but nevertheless, there are many efforts to try and convert the Jews to be Christian at this point. Now, it's interesting that at this time the Russians forced everyone to take a last name. Now, last name was never much of a Jewish thing before this point, but that was one way the Russians tried to keep record of families, and especially within the conscription and the recruitment to the army, they would, last names were an attempt to help them. Now, the Russians had a policy, as many armies have today, of never taking a ben yachid. In other words, if a family only had one boy, that boy was not required to go to the army. So, the Yiddish cup, the Jewish brain comes in, and what happened? Well, every boy and every family would have a different last name. So when the Russian officials would come to try and recruit or take their quotas for the army, they would say, "What do you mean? We only have one Landis." But then, there'd be another son with a maiden with the mother's name, with the mother's maiden name, or a different made up name altogether, or and that's what would happen, and that's why you would have families where they would you'd have siblings with different last names. You'd have siblings, or you'd have children with different last names from their fathers. For example, my wife's grandfather's last name was Goldwasser, and his father's last name was Weinstock, and my brother-in-law's father, his last name is Stillerman, and his uncle has a different last name, because again, they were all within the Russian Empire, trying to avoid the Russian army as much as possible. And this really begins a culture that we see throughout Eastern Europe at this time, that for the Jew to be able to survive, they've got to cheat the government, because if they go with the flow of the government, there's just no way you can survive. There's no way you can make it as a Jew, and therefore the Jewish community is always trying to figure out ways to get away from the government and to cheat the government, because that is the only way that the Jews can survive. Now, unfortunately, that attitude is not going to dissipate easily. So that when Jews come to countries with more benevolent governments that actually try to function as normal governments, like in modern times, you're going to unfortunately see this attitude deeply ingrained within the Jewish community. I like to be dan l'kaf schus, to give the benefit of the doubt when we see, unfortunately, Jewish white-collar criminals, which we all know is a thing, unfortunately, that the tendency to ignore the government, we'll say, or to violate laws, really comes from this time period, because in many communities it's in the mother's milk of Jews from many centuries of living under oppressive governments, that the only way you can survive is by cheating the government. And unfortunately, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, I'm just saying it's trying to give the benefit of the doubt, but unfortunately as that is translated into more modern times in America, Israel, and hopefully countries with benevolent governments, is let's say an attitude of not taking the law of the land very seriously, even though there's a concept dina d'malchus dina. As a Jew, we have to follow the law of the land, but I believe that's where to give the benefit of the doubt, that's where we see this attitude of not taking the law seriously, unfortunately, come up. And in communities that are, let's say, a little bit closer to the European experience, in other words, who have made themselves a little bit more insular and protected themselves from the outside world, they're going to have a little bit more of that attitude that was in our mother's milk from Europe, that is, not to trust the outside world, not to trust the governments around us, and the negative inverse of that is not to follow the laws of the government around us. Again, not saying it's okay. It's not okay. It's a terrible thing. But to give the benefit of the doubt to at least where it comes from, I believe it's from this time period where it becomes, like I said, put into our mother's milk to a certain extent, and therefore for many communities and many families and many people, it's been very hard to get this out of the Jewish community. And this is really the Russia we see. Russia's just never been a good place for the Jews. It's never been a place where the Jews have had it easy. And even though there are certain, we mentioned that in the Napoleonic Wars that the Jews supported the Tsar because they were afraid of the assimilation that Napoleon would bring. So after the Napoleonic Wars, there's a certain lightening up of the Jews. We're going to see, like we said, with Alexander II. And his more liberal policies, there'll be a certain lightening up of the Jews. But every time things lighten up for the Jews, similar to what we saw when, after Gorbachev and Yeltsin and Putin, in the early days of Putin, a certain lightening up of the situation. It might last for a decade or two, tops, or a couple years, maybe a decade or two, but it always comes back to this attitude of just a terrible, terrible place for the Jews to live, at this time. Now, I want to touch on two characters that come into the world scene, two of the Jewish personalities that come into the world at this time. First of all, one of the most famous Jews at this time is Sir Moses Montefiore. Now, Sir Moses Montefiore was a Sephardic Jew born in London, and he's a bit of a rags to riches story. Not quite rags to riches, but we'll say lower middle class to riches. And that is that he becomes really on the coattails of the Rothschilds. He becomes a stockbroker within the Rothschilds bank, and really becomes rich on their coattails. Now, the Rothschilds, as we discussed before, made their money in the war, first of the War of 1812, and then of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Waterloo, the War of 1815. And really through financing both sides of the war, and by picking the winners, because they were able to get information before everyone else. They had the concept of the carrier pigeons, getting updates from the front lines long before everyone else, and making their investments based on those pieces of information. And there's one story that is told. Again, I don't know if it's fact or fiction, but they don't tell these stories about you and me, so we can learn a lot from just the character of the story, if nothing else. But a story is told that on the day of the Battle of Waterloo, or one of the days of the Battle of Waterloo, that Lord Rothschild, the original Rothschild, the OR, so to speak, came to the British stock market and just sat down. And in the early hours of the day, he started selling off his stocks, and everyone saw that Rothschild was selling, and they knew that Rothschild was prone to have information information before everyone else. So everyone else started selling. There was a big sell-off that day. And the British stock market fell 15 to 20% that day. And then Rothschild got word that really the British were winning the Battle of Waterloo. So he turned around and bought all the stocks back at a 15 to 20% discount. And it said that in that one day alone, that much of the Rothschild fortune was built. So Montefiore, this is long before the days of the SEC, insider trading, anything like that. And Montefiore benefits from this as well and becomes the tremendous millionaire that he becomes in this time period. And one of the reasons why he's one of the most notable and respected figures in Jewish history is because once he makes his millions, he turns around and dedicates himself to Jewish philanthropy and to Jewish causes, all the time remaining a traditional observant Jew, even growing and becoming more observant as the years go on. And we can't say the same thing about the Rothschilds. We'll see that many of the Rothschilds do not remain very philanthropic or committed to the Jewish community. But Montefiore becomes a shining example of philanthropy and really taking his wealth and what he has to do what he can for the Jewish people. And two of the most famous examples of this were that in 1840, we have what's known as the Damascus Affair. We have a blood libel in Damascus in Syria. Now, what's interesting is the whole concept of the blood libel had existed already for several hundred years, but it was a Christian concept. It existed in Christian lands because it was tied to the blood of Jesus, the Jews taking the blood of the Christian child because they took the blood of Jesus and putting it into the matzahs. It was a Christian canard. It was not a Muslim canard per se. In other words, the Muslims never said that the Jews took the blood of Muhammad. There was never an accusation that Jews killed Muhammad, like there was an accusation that Jews killed Jesus. So blood libels did not exist in Muslim communities. But at this point in the mid-19th century, Syria had come under the French sphere of influence. And even though it was still part of the Ottoman Empire was already known at this point as the sick man of Europe. It was teetering. Now, it teetered for about 300 years, but it teetered. It was now in its last century on the brink of its, or not quite on the brink, but leading towards its collapse at the end of World War I. And Syria was already under the French influence. So you had French Christians already in Syria as missionaries, and they were protected by the French government. And one of those people was someone by the name of Father Thomas. And Father Thomas had a Muslim servant, and the two of them went missing one day. And right away, the French Council of Syria blamed their disappearance on the Jewish community and said that it was a blood libel. They were killed by the Jews in order for the blood to be taken for the matzahs. Now, this was in February, so it was close enough to Pesach when they would need to start preparing for for Pesach and making their matzahs. And the French Council saw to it that many Jews were arrested and were interrogated and were tortured, and under the pressure of torture confess, which, a confession under torture, like, I've never understood how that can be valid. And when people are tortured, they'll say anything to get the torture to stop. But large numbers, maybe 20, 30, 40 Jews are arrested and imprisoned in Damascus. Many of those Jews will die in prison. And it was not a very good moment for the Jews of Damascus, to say the least. Now, at this point, Montefiore intercedes. He goes to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and insists that the Jews be released from prison, that this is a canard, that they were not involved in this murder. And what's interesting is Montefiore has an influence on the officers of the Sultan. He meets with the Sultan himself, and eventually the Jews are released from the prison in Damascus based on Montefiore's intercedence in the situation. And this made a tremendous influence on Jews around the world, Jews within the Ottoman Empire, the Jews of Syria, and Jews in France, because they saw this influential Jew making a difference for the plight of Jews in the world. Now, the whole thing was, as every blood libel on the map of world history was, a total canard from the beginning to the end. Now, many Jews had thought that they had moved in Western Europe. We have to remember, this is in the height of the Reform movement. Jews throughout Germany and France have been emancipated and are secularized and assimilated, and the Jews thought that they were done with the canards like this. And here, within the French sphere of influence, they see the old anti-Semitism coming back, and we're going to see it's going to come into France in a major way, a little bit later. But like the Jews of France and the Jews of Germany and the Jews of the Western world thought they were past this, and here they see it all over again. But on the flip side, they see that it is the intercedence of a Jew like Montefiore who does make the difference, and these Jews are freed. Now, the French consul who blamed the whole thing in the first place, insisted on these Jews being arrested, he knew from day one that there was no blood libel. He knew from the day one what type of person he was dealing with in Father Thomas and his servant, and he knew they were involved in shady business practices, and he knew that they were most likely killed by some or murdered by some people they had double-crossed in business, and that is almost for sure what happened. And the French consul knew all this, yet nevertheless he used the opportunity to perpetrate this anti-Semitic situation that was definitely a sign of things to come within France and within the Western world in the coming decades, in the coming years. Now, another thing that another area where Montefiore tried to use his influence was actually with the Tsar. In 1846, as at this point Russia was starting to show signs of liberalism. Again, we'll only call it signs or wins because they never liberalize. But Montefiore actually meets with the Tsar and encourages him to lighten up on the way the Jews were treated. And sure enough, the Tsar is impressed with Montefiore, and there's a certain lightening up of the situation for the Jews in Russia under the influence of Montefiore when he comes to Russia. Now, the other area where, besides trying to intercede on anti-Semitism across Europe, and the other place where Montefiore is really famous, his influence is felt, was in Eretz Israel, was in the land of Israel, because Montefiore in these pre-Zionist days tries to bolster the Jewish presence in Israel, and this is just before the first Aliyah. This is you have there the old Yishuv of the students of the Vilna Gaon and the students of the Baal Shem Tov, and Montefiore tries to do what he can to bolster that community. Now, in truth, a lot of the idea came from a friend of Montefiore's who was back in America, and we'll talk about America and the Jews in America in a coming session, but a man by the name of Judah Turo. If you're familiar with the famous Turo College, so it's named for Judah Turo. He was a great Jewish philanthropist, also a Sephardic Jew, and in America this time. And when he passed away, Montefiore was made the executor of his estate, and a large amount of his estate was left for the Jewish community in Eretz Israel. And so Montefiore, with his friend Turo's funds and a lot of his own funds, goes to Israel and starts to try and help out the Jewish community there. He builds a number of agricultural settlements, donates all kinds of money all over the country, and he begins the first Jewish settlement outside of the walls of the old city and what we call the new city of Jerusalem. And this is the first time that we see Jews really living outside of the old city. And there's a neighborhood that's eventually named for him called Yamin Moshe. It's now one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Jerusalem, near Rechavia, and this is beginning Mea Sharim, and really the beginning of those neighborhoods outside of the old city, which eventually become the new city of Jerusalem. Now, one of the things that Montefiore does is he wants to help out the old yeshiv, so he builds a windmill with the hope of helping the Jews of the old yeshiv to make grain. The only problem is there's not a lot of wind in Jerusalem, but the windmill still stands as a memorial to Montefiore, known as Montefiore's Windmill in Jerusalem, and really his influence is in many ways he helps to sustain the community, the fledgling community of Jews that is in Israel in the late 19th century. Now, the Crimean War was we mentioned it before, vis-a-vis Russia. The Crimean War was a war that really finds its roots in the land of Israel because it was really a dispute that broke out on who controlled the Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. Was it the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, or was it the Western Roman Catholic Church? And therefore, the war breaks out between those two sides, with Russia on one side and the Ottoman Empire, who technically controlled Israel at that point, but the Ottoman Empire aligned themselves with France, the United Kingdom, and Russia will lose this war. It'll be an embarrassment for Russia, as we saw it at least bring an end to the schools of the Cantonistim. But the other thing that it does is besides embarrassing Russia, it wakes up Tsar Nikolai I to realize that the reason that Russia lost was because Russia is backwards, and they needed to become more modern like the rest of the world, because the Industrial Revolution had already hit these other parts of the world, and it had yet to hit Russia. So Tsar Nikolai starts to lighten up on a lot of the decrees. He makes an effort to modernize Russia, makes an effort to modernize the Russian army, and that's a result of what this Crimean War that like I said, had certain good things for the Jews, but ultimately that's going to bounce back after Alexander II is killed by and that's blamed on the Jews. Now, the one last person I want to mention tonight is, just to bounce back to Western Europe for a minute, is Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch lived from the year 1808 to 1888 and had a tremendous influence in Germany during the latter part, or the middle to latter part of the 19th century. Now, at this point, Reform had already taken over most of Germany and wreaked its havoc and bringing assimilation to the Jews, and the emancipation, eventually assimilation to the Jews, and much of the Jewish community in Germany had run far from traditional Judaism. But Shimshon Raphael Hirsch enters as a fierce opponent of reform, and really in many ways saves the German Jewish community, so that today we still have the concept of the German Jew, the German Yaka, because he comes in and fights reform vehemently, and what he does and how he does it is he first of all, insists from the get-go at the highest level of Jewish observance. Jewish observance cannot be compromised for anything. Torah learning cannot be compromised for anything. Your connection to Judaism cannot be compromised for anything. Yet he comes up with the philosophy known as Torah im derech eretz, which means Torah with the ways of the world, and he essentially brings the concepts of emancipation and reform and enlightenment and what have you to the traditional community, and says that you can go to university, you can get a degree, you can study philosophy. Hirsch himself went to university, and he says, but at the same time, you have to keep the highest levels of Torah observance. So what he did, unlike his people who came before him, like Montefiore, like Mendelssohn, who himself remained a traditional Jew, but only pushed emancipation and enlightenment and put no influence on remaining Jewish, remaining connected to Jewish observance, and therefore, as we saw, he didn't even have a Jewish grandchild, and he led to the German Reform movement, which led to complete assimilation of so many German Jews. Hirsch said the opposite. You can have all that. You can go to the university, but you must do whatever you can to protect your Judaism. And that was Hirsch's goal, to set up that system. And therefore, he refused to work with the Reform. There were many communities where whatever was left of traditional Judaism would be together with the Reform, at least trying to work in the same community. But when Hirsch came to Frankfurt am Main, which was where he had his big influence, they called it the Successionist Orthodox community, because they did not work with the Frankfurt Jewish community, which was completely controlled by the Reform, and he built his own community. Now, I heard recently from a friend of mine who is a great-grandson, I don't know how many great-grandson of Rav Hirsch, Rav Baruch Mordechai Hirsch in Eretz Yisrael, where he told me that when Rav Hirsch came to Frankfurt, there was less than 1 million of Shomer Shabbos. There were not even 10 Shomer Shabbos Jews. I'm sorry, there were not even 10 Shomer Shabbos Jews left in Frankfurt. And Hirsch is going to turn all that around. Really, in many ways, he's one of the first Kiruv workers, one of the first Jewish outreach workers. He's going to build a community of 500 families, and is going to have a tremendous influence on German Jewry, because he's going to show you can go to university, you can be modern, you can have all this, but he's going to teach people how to do that while remaining fiercely committed to Judaism and to observant Judaism, and therefore really create the concept, if you will, of the modern Orthodox Jew, in which today we live in a world that Jews, with yarmulkes or have any kind of job, go to doctors, lawyers, accountants, Indian chiefs, and anything in between, yet remain fiercely committed to Torah Judaism. They go to Minyan 3 times a day. They learn Torah on a daily basis, Shomer Shabbos, and the concept of being able to do that in many ways comes from Hirsch, and his influence therefore is, even though it was in Germany initially, it is throughout the Jewish world in many ways. Now, beyond having this tremendous influence, he was also a very prolific writer and gave us many wonderful Jewish works on Jewish philosophy that are studied and are part of any Jewish study hall, of any Jewish based medrash. The Hirsch Chumash is a famous one, the 19 letters, Chorev, all tremendous tremendous works on Jewish philosophy that Hirsch gave to us. But really what Hirsch gives to us is that concept of being able to exist in the modern world and still be a committed Jew. And like that, he is able to stem the tide of reform in Germany and really give us a concept, give us an impression of how we should all be in the modern world, and we should all live up to what Hirsch has given to us. Okay, with that, I'm going to wish you a great week, and next week we will continue talking about these wonderful years of the 19th century. We'll begin to talk about Haskalah, and hopefully we'll talk about the yeshiva movement as well, and we'll continue to try and understand the beginning of the modern Jewish world, and so we can have a deeper understanding of the world that we all find ourselves in today. I wish you all a wonderful week, and I'll look forward to talking to you more next week. Have a great one.